Hey guys, welcome back to Break the Gate podcast. Today we have an Evan Bailey. He is the vice president. He also is the director of marketing for Disco Donnie Presents. They do Sunset, Freaky Deaky, Extensions Paradise Blues, and also recently So What Festival with Third String. And Mike Seamer's a great guy. I'm glad that you guys were able to develop a partnership with that. Thanks so much for coming on into the podcast and talking about your industry a little bit.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, we kind of get into this with every person that we bring on. Can you go into your journey in the entertainment industry and how it evolved into Disco Donnie?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to keep it to like the 2-minute version.
Okay.
I've always loved music pretty much as long as I can remember, and kind of grew up in a house where music and vinyl were playing, and my parents were excited about it. And I think probably around the time I was 12 or 13, it was kind of the beginning of the grunge era, so it smells like Teen Spirit kind of.
Sure.
I think it knocked Michael Jackson out of the charts for the last time. And, the world was changing. So I was very much caught up in that. Picked up a guitar, started playing guitar, kind of kept up with that through high school. Had friends who played other instruments, and we'd get together little jam sessions, and eventually moved into a house together. I graduated early specifically so I can move into a house with musicians and just play music and listen to music, and that's all I sort of cared about. And strangely enough, I had a job at the time. I was just telling my wife this story this morning, so we were actually in that town, but I had a job at an amusement park not far from here. It's maybe 45 minutes. The park's no longer open, but one of the interesting things about that job was I was paid at the end of the summer, sort of a commission based on, I was a gamer, so I was
Sure.
this is kind of a strange angle, but I swear it's going somewhere.
Yeah.
So I was paid at the end of the summer in one lump sum, and I met some people there who were going to early raves, essentially. At that time, I was essentially the Cleveland market. And they got me kind of excited about the music and took me to a couple parties, and, a couple things clicked. And that summer I had planned to buy a guitar, Paul Reed Smith. I'd saved up all my money to do just that. And I remember very clearly when I went to the store to buy that Paul Reed Smith, something in me kind of clicked. Ended up buying turntables, brought it back to this house where I was living, and the people, I was living with, who were essentially bandmates, were like, what is this about?
Yeah.
And I remember I was really excited about it. Eventually they kind of came around and were interested in it too, but I just, through a couple different shows and association with other people, I kind of got sucked into that. And then I wanted to DJ, and I was always the guy at the front row of a rave. Raves used to be a little less distance between you and the DJ, and I would just watch the decks all night. And since I had a little bit of musical background, I was like, oh, they're doing a rotation, and on the turnaround, they're dropping the next record, and they're building harmonies and things. And I loved the improvisational nature of it. It reminded me a lot of jazz, which is kind of where I had sort of migrated to toward the end of high school and early college. So I immediately realized, oh, this is musical, indeed. Yeah. And a lot of people didn't believe that, including a lot of musicians. And some probably still don't. And I understand why too. But so I was very interested in DJing, and I was experimenting with different things, playing with bands, playing on my own, playing different styles. And a friend of mine and we started a club night together where I lived at the time, Kent, Ohio, which is kind of a college town. And he was really into drum and bass, so he wanted to do a drum and bass night. And we started throwing a drum and bass night, and I was sort of the oddball out because I played essentially house and techno and tribal stuff, or whatever the flavor was that I was interested in at the moment. And we kind of built it up, and we were working with a lot of people from Philadelphia at the time, people like Diesel Boy and sign, and actually Kevin Gimbel, who I still work with till this day.
Okay.
And we used to put DJs on trains and stuff, and
Yeah.
bring
That's
them to
cool.
Cleveland. And we kind of grew and grew, and eventually I sort of grew into the Cleveland market as a DJ.
Sure.
Met another promoter, and we started doing bigger shows, and I would help him with the shows. People like Paul Van Dyke, for instance. And ironically, Paul Van Dyke, around that time, his agent was Michelle Servet, who works for DDP now. So I got to know Michelle during that time, and we really liked her. And around that time, Donnie had just come out of the Rave Act, essentially nonsense, and Hurricane Katrina, and he had moved up to Ohio, and he was in Columbus, and I was in Cleveland. So essentially, for a minute, we were, I don't want to say competitors, but he kind of moved into the circle.
Sure.
And at that time, things were a little more tribal or competitive, or I don't know what the
Right.
word is for it, but it was not the
Yeah.
world of AEGs and Live Nations at that time. So I
Right.
was, like, oh snap, Donnie moved into Ohio. Like, I knew exactly who he was because he had this sort of
Right.
legendary status in the South through doing the Zulu parties and the like. And also, he became sort of this lightning rod for the conversation related to the First Amendment and electronic music. And I knew he had essentially fought, Biden and all those people in the state Supreme Court and won with the help of the ACLU. So I was like, this guy was a force, right? So
a big deal. Yeah.
And I've told the story before, but I'll never forget the first time I heard from him. It was, I think Mike, the guy I worked with, like forwarded an email, and it was something like, we should work together, not apart.
Yeah.
And I remember very clearly. And back then I was sort of, I'd gone to college for advertising design. So I was doing a lot of that sort of stuff. And Donnie and I started working together on that. And it was just me and him. And at the time, Donnie he had been doing this in the South, but kind of routing DJs almost like you would with rock bands, which wasn't,
Okay.
Tour buses and the like.
Sure.
And that wasn't done a lot back then. I mean, there was a couple tours like Moonshine Over America, et cetera, but he was developing this model, and I sort of helped him with that, where we would route, stuff from Cleveland to Columbus to Indy to Nashville, maybe back down to Florida and Texas. And essentially that became sort of the blueprint for sort of the DDP business model. Eventually festivals came,
Sure.
buyouts, mergers with Insomniac, buyouts with SFX and Lifestyle, et cetera. But that's kind of the short version of the story.
Gotcha. Okay. That's a very detailed and good story, though.
You never know how it's going to connect until you look backwards.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So you're in Florida now, though. You weren't always in Florida.
No, our offices.
You in
we
Ohio?
have a lot of people in offices in Florida.
Yeah.
Like accounting's there, Michelle's there, a few other people. But
Okay.
Most of DDP actually works remotely. Like Donnie's in Puerto Rico. I'm actually still in Cleveland. I'm in Shaker Heights, which is kind of the east side of Cleveland. We have people in St. Louis and Texas, and we were kind of uniquely positioned when the pandemic came around. We're like, oh, we know how to do this.
Yeah,
part of our strength and part of the model.
That's really cool. It's good that you're able to adapt that that easily too. A lot of people weren't able to.
Yeah.
So as the vice president, marketing director, I know those are kind of two different realms, depending on what you're doing. Could you go into some of the primary responsibilities and what you do?
Yeah. I mean, my background was in, both my undergrad and graduate degrees were in things like advertising and design and journalism. So it's always been an interest of mine, the combination of, you were speaking to this, before we started, just combining things you love, right? Music, art, film. It's always been something that interested me. So I kind of transferred that, I think, into the company. And so in short, I sort of look after things in the marketing workflow, anytime, from sort of concept to, when people buy the ticket or after the event, et cetera, it's kind of that marketing umbrella. So I sort of we have great teams. We have an excellent marketing team, for instance, sort of marketing and strategy. So I hesitant to even call myself the marketing director at this point. It's like sort of
Yeah.
a collaborative thing. We have great video teams, great PR teams. So I try to sort of be the glue that kind of holds that together. Um,
Okay.
Often I think because of my background, I'll get roped into things like the communications with the city, or if we
Mm,
have,
yep.
I don't know, events are funny, right? Like there's quote unquote
Yeah.
crises like weather or something. So often I kind of oversee that particular piece.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean it's a variety of things. I help create festival brands. I do most of our club um, art workflows. We all have our own little
Okay.
things.
Yeah.
I kind of oversee the brand partnerships that we create at festivals, which is a big task in itself.
Yeah.
But even communications related stuff like rideshare programs, philanthropy, things of that
Hmm.
nature. So while I'm very involved with like day to day stuff, I often try to look at I guess bigger picture stuff. Whether it be community outreach we're doing or programs we're developing, things of that nature too. We're a
Sure.
small team,
So
so a
you're
lot of us kind of wear a lot of
multiple
hats
hats. Yeah, absolutely.
and
Yeah.
collaborate.
Sure. And it's the best way to kind of provide everybody's strengths. It's not like
Mhm.
a very corporate structure where like your job is this, you stay in that lane. This is more of a like, if you've got an asset, you've got a strength,
Yeah.
by all means, let's use it and let's figure out how we can incorporate it with everything else.
Yeah, we often actually sort of joke about getting rid of job titles because,
Yeah.
it's we're small and collaborative. People have their experiences and sort of knowledge bases, but so often, it's like we'll help each other, with a variety of things. So
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Could you go into a little bit more about Disco Donnie Presents and
sure.
the significance of it? I know it's been around for quite a while.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Donnie had been doing stuff in the South prior,
Mhm. Yeah.
so
Yeah, so disco started in 1992, or wait, 93 rather. So
okay,
next year we'll actually celebrate our 30th year of business.
okay,
So it's been around a while. Initially I wasn't part of what Donnie was creating in New Orleans, but that's where he sort of got
hmm,
his start. And there's tons of great articles and interviews and stuff out there about that if anybody's interested. But a lot of really colorful stories. I mean, New Orleans, if you've been, is kind of a colorful place by default. And that was part
yeah,
of sort of Donnie's, I don't know, artistic style. I guess when it comes to
sure,
creating events, like he would pull performers off the street, and he had this venue that he primarily worked at called the State Palace Theater. It's kind of the stuff of legends now. There's actually an excellent documentary about it called Rise, the story
okay,
of the rave outlaw Disco Donnie. And I've watched it recently. It's aging well. The music's good, the
yeah,
footage, but it kind of captures what I'm talking about. Donnie's he's a typical, great promoter. He's always thinking bigger and better and, how to make things, advance. So, as he
sure,
continued with his events, people started to notice. In the 90s, if you were around in the dance scene, we were sort of a lot of people were worried about dance music. It was kind of
sure,
like a
yeah,
lot of genres when it first comes out, whether it be jazz or the sort of the 60s or disco or whatever. There's often a part of culture that doesn't like that there's an underground
yeah,
culture.
yep,
And eventually it kind of comes to the mainstream and it's okay. But the government was very interested, not in a good way, about the rave movement essentially. And I
hmm,
recall being in clubs on the East Coast like Buzz in DC and seeing police helicopters above us and just watching what we were
wow,
doing, and a lot of I performed numerous parties that got shut down by the police. And some
yeah,
of it was probably permits and the like, but I think a lot of it was just sort of the climate. So
sure,
Donnie, I won't go too far into the story because it's complicated, but he was essentially, they were using and I hate to get political because
Yeah.
I, I actually want better presidential candidates on both sides, in my opinion. But
Sure,
um,
absolutely, and it's an open
yeah,
conversation. No
it is.
judgment. You could whatever you want to talk about. We're here for it.
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, Biden was a senator at that time and basically
Yeah,
drafted legislation called the RAVE Act, reducing America's vulnerability to ecstasy. And what that act
interesting.
did
Okay,
is, if you know a little bit about Biden's history, he was, um, it's probably some of like the criticism of his record deals with how he dealt with crime, whether it be in African American communities, et cetera. And this was part of that. And
okay,
essentially, what this was legislation was doing was, if you were a rave promoter, you were the government had the ability to charge you with what they called the crack house statute, which basically meant you were creating a place where people could do illegal things. So not only were you sort of essentially guilty of their actions, but also a higher charge of creating this space. So
interesting.
they tried to test this out on Donnie, and there's stuff out there about this, and I'm probably
Yeah,
misquoting some of this stuff. In fact, often when I work with Donnie on press related to this, he's like, "No, that's not right. This is the real
yeah,
story." So take it
yeah.
with a grain of salt, but there is a lot of stuff out there. So much so this went up to cover of Time magazine. This was a big
Yeah.
deal. So when Donnie was the first person, I guess, charged with it. And they sort of shut down the State Palace Theater for a time. Um, and during this, people like me that were, doing events in Cleveland and stuff, we were keeping a really close eye on this, because it was like, if this guy goes down, like this whole industry goes down.
Yeah.
And eventually the case sort of fell apart because it was stupid. But in short, and I'll let listeners kind of look it up themselves and make their own decisions. But it didn't hold water. I'll put it to you that way. So
Sure.
when Donnie came to Ohio, and I kind of already told this story, he was sort of growing club markets around the U.S. And I think around 2011 or 2012, well, actually back up, late 2008-ish, we ended up merging with Insomniac. So we were
Okay.
sort of, we became Insomniac East, and they were sort of
Hmm.
Insomniac West. And what we were doing is developing EDCs around the country. Like there was Puerto Rico, Denver, Dallas, a lot of the markets where we still are active. We did that for a few years. A lot of big entities were coming in on electronic as it was getting popular around
Sure.
2010. Um, so these are long stories I'm condensing, but
Yeah.
we kind of
No,
knew,
it's
everybody
okay.
sort of knew like Live Nation and AEG were coming for this genre because there was money in it.
Right.
So we ended up selling to SFX, or Insomniac
Mm,
kind of broke in half. We went with SFX,
sure.
fastball, and then went with Live Nation. SFX was part of this big roll up, and so companies like Beatport, Tomorrowland, Tomorrow World, I should say,
Yep.
um, Electric Zoo, Life in Color, you name it.
Yep.
All these companies were rolled up, and it was actually really interesting. I mean, it sort of, it was a famous flop, it was a stock play, but it was actually really interesting because I learned so much from these other companies, especially abroad, that have been doing festivals for so long. A lot of what I know about brand partnership, I learned during that time. Um, for instance, I had a mentor, Teresa Velasquez, who was actually killed in that Miami condo collapse a couple of years
Oh
ago.
wow.
She was,
Oh man, I'm sorry.
yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's tragic, of course.
Yeah.
But she was sort of this Live Nation executive eventually. But she taught me so much about brand partnership. I need to give her a nod. But it was like during that time that we learned so much, a lot of us, just about accounting and lawyers, et cetera. So it was a good process.
Yeah.
A couple more buyouts, or I should say one more buyout. And then in 2020, we bought the company back and became independent, which has been great since then.
Yeah.
Actually, I think Donnie's probably one of the only people that ever sell his company and then buy it back. But
Yeah.
it's been fun. We've created some new brands, new verticals like travel, doing some, in my opinion, interesting new stuff. As you pointed out, working with So What and Mike Zimmer on rock shows. We're doing an
Mhm.
Eclipse festival in the spring of 24. So kind of just taken the gloves off and made us really nimble. But we still have those lessons from, you know, working with those other companies. So, in my opinion, it's been a pretty cool journey. But
Yeah,
those are the
absolutely.
Cliff's notes of DDP, I guess.
Yeah. I feel like of all independent talent buying companies, you guys were the most unique because of the experience that you guys have, the different involvements of different companies. And then, obviously you said being able to buy yourself back out, of selling it. There's not a lot of companies, especially independent ones, that have been able to do stuff like that and get all this experience, there, and then for it being relatively a young company, it's a big deal.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. I sometimes the music industry is. It's like we sometimes joke, and I've heard other people joke this, but it's like dog years.
Yeah.
It's like 10 years ago feels so long ago in the music industry.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. So, in your experience, we're gonna start going into more of like the marketing specific
Sure.
questions now. But so, in your experience, what are some of the key factors that help with the success of marketing and promoting events and festivals?
Um, I think, staying fan sort of centric. A lot of people talk about sort of the consumer experience in a lot of industries, but I think it's sort of first and foremost. It's always something that's really interested me, and I've noticed, and something I picked up working with Donnie and Pasquale, et cetera, is like just this obsession with sort of the consumer mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really good way to sort of ground yourself. And with that, we're on a podcast talking about entering the music biz. I
Mm-hmm.
think people should not be afraid to work a variety of positions at events. That nothing should ever feel below you. I mean, certainly you can be taken advantage of, but still, like you can learn a lot by working the front gate, selling water, helping people in the parking lot. I mean, to understand all those little pieces is kind of what, in my opinion, sort of makes you experienced or a master.
Sure.
In fact, we started a program called Disco U for people who are kind of interested in entering the music biz. And one of the things we do is we take them around to each department
Oh, that's
so they
cool.
understand how it clicks together, but also
Yep.
maybe they've become really passionate about, the ADA experience or
Yeah.
food and beverage. You just don't know. And I was actually talking with somebody, Amanda, on our marketing team about this. And she's like, wouldn't that have been great when we started as employees? And I said, well,
Mm-hmm.
my story is a little different, but yes, I
Yeah.
totally agree. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. I think that's super important. Um, I think with music marketing, you have to. It's a really weird balance of like staying up to date with things like social media, for instance. I know that's sort of a no brainer, but it's also a balance of knowing kind of what worked and sort of
Mm-hmm.
not breaking it the next time you do it because you find yourself in these
Sure.
annual cycles. So we take a lot of notes and something we try to get better and better at. What sold tickets this day and that day, et cetera. So I think good record keeping can really inform your process. And create meaningful experimentation. For example, the new thing like TikTok enters the last couple of years. There's stuff you should still be doing, and then maybe that's adding on. You're not necessarily moving all your chips to that pile. So I think
Yeah.
those are a couple things. I try to keep in mind, and just being able to want to explore things. People will get a little bit set. We get so many vendor inquiries, and a lot of times I try to meet with those people just to see if they have something fresh or interesting, um,
Sure.
just to give us sort of an edge. So
Yeah.
develop a culture of experimentation and openness, um, and also being open to being wrong. You know,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of people like to cover their tracks or they just can't check the ego or whatever, but it's
Right.
okay to be wrong. It's how you learn, and it's
Yeah.
like, so I think that's part of it too. And I know those are all sort of psychological things I'm talking about, but I think
Yep.
they make a good foundation for kind of the tactical or strategic stuff that organizations engage in.
Yeah. To kind of build on that, it's okay to be wrong thing. It's also okay to be right. in a sense to where you don't necessarily have to make an example out of it either.
Mhm.
I think there's always a battle of, oh, I said this in the team meeting and nobody listened, and then now they're like realizing that they should have listened to me, versus there's a battle of, I said this and to in front of the team and they went with it and that was wrong. So there's like two different sides of that, and finding the equal middle or the middle ground between the two is where you're going to get the best character development, as far as
Yeah.
working with the team.
It's actually really interesting. I mean, leadership is probably a whole podcast in itself, but
Sure.
I find myself working with a lot of essentially Gen Z employees, and I've watched the working styles change over the years. For example, there's much more coaching, and one thing I've just sort of learned over the years is that I think if you can make people's sort of objectives clear for success, they'll not only feel good about it and understand what to do, but also you have a metric to kind of talk about, how to improve performance essentially in a meaningful way, one that doesn't feel personal, for instance.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, there's a lot there for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how has the marketing landscape for festivals and events changed over the years? I know you went into this a
Yeah,
little bit with the TikTok and Instagram
yeah,
part
yeah,
of it. But with that, obviously
yeah,
there was a big uprise of change.
sure, yeah,
You know, how has that worked out for you? And what are some of the things you've
yeah.
done to work with it?
It kind of depends how far I go back. I mean, but I'll do it for the story. I mean, we used to print a lot of dead trees, print on a lot of dead
Yeah.
trees, a lot of
Yeah.
flyers, a lot of flyers. We still actually do some. It's the ROI on them is not bad, and in a couple of
Sure.
spots they can be meaningful. But while there were always sort of forums and email came around relatively early. Social media has changed a lot in the last, I don't know, 5 years or so for us. Like, for example, we've definitely gone much more into SMS marketing.
Okay.
Um, Obviously things like TikTok and Instagram, and maybe a little less Facebook, less printed publications, fewer radio ads unless the artist made sense, etc.
Sure.
But the one thing I would say is that, as the market changes, it's not totally about the mediums per se. It's more like the strategy as it relates
Okay.
to the culture. So a good example I'll give you is SMS has been around for a while. I mean, I used to text people on my phone, "Hey, you come to the club night?" Back in the '90s,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Obviously, the tools have gotten better, but one of the things that's different is people are doing a lot of pre-registration now with ticketing.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
And this basically does a couple things. As you can gauge interest in something, you can sort of quantify it, but it also informs not only the SMS process, but also some of the social targeting you do. So, it's an example of how these are older technologies. It's not like we invented this, but how we're approaching it sort of
Yeah.
changes. So I
Sure.
would say that's one of the big things, over the last couple of years is SMS has become more important, but especially through the lens of kind of contesting and pre-registration so that you can understand your data better, related to the potential customer base.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, So, do you guys use TikTok at all? I mean, I know you
Oh
said
yeah,
yeah, okay.
yeah,
How has that worked for you guys
sure.
in terms of conversions? Is it helped ticket sales, or is your ROA more in the SMS, that kind of thing?
Um, I mean, TikTok, it's a funny thing. Yeah, I'm trying to
Yeah.
think where to get started with this. So obviously, ads on platforms like Facebook have become less effective, especially
Yeah.
when you're looking at maybe an aspirational audience of those, 18 to 21. You're trying to
Yeah.
get new inroads. So, of course, yes, we've gone to TikTok. Now, TikTok presents its own challenges.
Sure.
For instance, it takes a lot of research. So there's a few, two or three people, depending on what project we're talking about, that tend to research these things. So, what are the trending sounds? What are the trending sort of videos, etc. So you're often kind of remixing what's happening with pop culture, so it has that
Okay.
traction. I don't know how much you're
Sure.
on TikTok, but like, I don't know.
Barely. My girlfriend's more on it than I am.
Got it. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm not, admittedly, this is sort of a
Yeah.
younger person's game. So there's a lot of
Sure.
research that goes into it. We probably need to do more. We do run ads. Um, I think the conversion, it certainly can convert. I think
Yeah.
it's getting better, but that was initially a challenge for us, was just the conversion rates and measurement and the like. Um,
Yeah.
Another thing is certain artists kind of come from that world and do really well, and they
Sure.
themselves have a presence there. For example, a lot of legacy acts might not, somebody my age might not really do a ton on there, right? So therefore, they
Right.
wouldn't be necessarily the best match. But artists like Disco Lines, for instance, that kind of became known on that platform, that's probably a no-brainer that you would run ads
Sure.
for those sort of shows.
Yeah.
So that's some of the nuances we often think about. But I see it all the time, and when things are working, we tend to double down, So I see these conversations all the time. Like, do we have TikTok running? Yeah. How's it doing? Pretty good. Okay, let's double it.
Yeah.
So those are sort of things we see happen.
Absolutely. I think that's standard for any industry,
Yeah.
especially the music industry.
Mhm.
Um, we have, with, Google and Yahoo search and all that stuff, we have SEO optimizations,
Mhm.
different things that we could do all in the back end. We can see all the metrics, all the analytics, how old this person is, where their IP is located, stuff like
Right.
that. Those tools worked great for so long. Well, now we've got things like, TikTok and Instagram, Facebook, and they
Mhm.
don't always work well with each other in terms of analytics. It's hard to get that conversion over. I was just having this conversation with a previous podcast guest where we were talking about the conversion of getting people who were watching an artist on TikTok over to Spotify and getting Spotify numbers up. There's still a weird space between the two where, for lack of better wording, people are too ADHD to where they don't really go above and beyond and go to the platform of Spotify and be like, okay, I remember this from
Mhm.
TikTok. I'm gonna go over and listen to the song now
Yeah.
on Spotify. So it's really hard to grasp that information and that following over to other things like ticket buys and that
Yeah.
type of thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So
A lot of time
uh
involved with it. A lot of questions.
yeah. And I think, you know, people are still trying to figure it out. Um, it's just one of those things. I think I lost you on mic. Oh, there we go. Okay, it
Yeah.
cut out for a second.
No, it's fine. I had it muted for a second. There was
Oh,
no.
okay. um, so which channels? I guess not to kind of beat the horse a little bit, but which channels have been working best for you guys?
Um, I would say SMS has
Yeah,
been, as I mentioned, kind of important. I mean, there's still very healthy budgets on, Facebook and Instagram. I would say we've probably increased our spends on things like Google Ads, especially search.
okay, yep,
Um, and I don't know, emails, remains part of it. We tend to be a little more selective about when we use email. It's not just blast after blast after blast.
sure,
It's often kind of related to like what we're doing with SMS, for instance. It might be like a festival goes on sale, you get a text, and, hey, tickets are on sale, and then hey, guess what? The email's there, and maybe it has a
yeah,
little bit more information or something along those lines.
okay.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know. My gut tells me to tell the story of SMS. It just seems like it's become a pretty important part of what we do over the last couple of
Yeah,
post pandemic, I would say.
absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And I feel like a lot more people are starting to catch on to that. I've see,
Yeah.
uh, subscriptions are easy thing to do. Um, so to go into specifics such as like subgenres, how do you kind of market your approach to subgenres of the events you're promoting, and how do you adapt your strategies to different genres to know what works for one thing may not work for another thing?
Um, yeah, I mean it's true. Artists are a pretty easy example. Some artists might be more native to TikTok, or if we're doing an older artist, we might look at platforms like Facebook. It kind of depends on where we think the eyeballs are.
Sure.
Um, but when it comes to like for instance, we're doing this rock festival in a couple of weeks. So what?
Yep.
And that's definitely outside DDP's sort of
Scope.
comfort zone. So it's a lot of
Yeah.
conversations with our partner Mike in that case.
Yeah.
He's always telling us, this might work for dance music, but it probably won't work for us. So
Right.
there's a little bit of that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Mike's great with helping people kind of see the potential of something too, and he's always been known for that. I had also had Johnny Grimes on here, at Furnace Fest, and he works with Mike pretty regularly, and it's one of the best things that he's done, as he says. um, could you? So I know we talked about SMS a little bit, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about the marketing behind it, because I feel like, I've actually read some of the stuff that you has been put out about your conversation with SMS. And I think SMS is kind of something that is pretty impactful. Could you go into a little bit more of what the marketing behind that looks like? How do you capture the data? How do you get the phone numbers, that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, emails are certainly, or I'm sorry, phone numbers are typically collected during, ticketing. So that's one source, but probably the primary source and the way we're using it from a strategic perspective is things like landing pages that, for instance, we might announce a festival and there's very little information. We might have a widget on the page that says, be the first to find out when the lineup drops, or maybe it's
Okay.
contested, or be the
Sure.
first to know when tickets go on sale, those sorts of things. And sometimes those are kind of promoted via ads too.
Yeah.
So we have, different sources where we're kind of feeding those data into that widget. And that bucket, those are essentially qualified leads, right? They entered a
Sure.
contest, they signed up on the page, whatever, but it showed kind of an interest in the product, or, a timeline moment. So
Yeah.
those, those often kind of, not only do they inform kind of, how we might do ad targeting, lookalikes and the like, but we deliver information to those people on a schedule, kind of based on their interest. So, while it's sort of simple, it's we're not just blindly putting things on sale and hoping it works out.
Sure.
We're looking for these qualified leads and sort of engaging them throughout the process. And like I said, we also, I have so many conversations on my phone. It's like, how many registrations today? We're looking at it
Yeah.
day by day.
Okay.
So there's a quantification piece to it,
Okay.
um, to help us understand, how it's going essentially, or what we think will
Sure.
happen.
Right.
But a lot of other promoters are doing this too. This is not sort of native to us. It's just become a pretty important part of how we put tickets on sale for major festivals.
Yeah, absolutely. So you also have this ambassador program too, which I've noticed. I mean, that kind of helps a little bit. How has that contributed to the marketing efforts of Disco Donnie? Has that helped quite a bit?
Yeah, it's definitely an important part of what we do. I talked a little bit about flyers and the
Yeah,
fact that we still do some. I mean, I think Donnie and me and a lot of us, we were promoters first, so the kind of boots on the ground mentality is important to us.
yeah,
So yeah, we like hard ticket sellers out there. People kind of
sure,
selling hard tickets, but we also recognize that there's a world of people out there who enjoy socially based rewards. That want to earn things, maybe more slowly, or just they're more interested in the VIP experience. So we have two programs, sort of a hard ticket program, and then also kind of like a socially based ambassador program where people can earn access to, different and expedited entry and things like that. So
Yeah.
we actually run two, and they kind of consider those two mindsets. People who are more money driven and more socially driven.
Okay.
Um, our hard ticket program, a lot of these sellers can sell a lot of tickets. So it's a
Yeah.
smaller group, but their revenue is really good. Whereas the socially based ambassadors, we tend to have more of them, thousands of them. They sell
Hmm.
fewer tickets, but it's more like a torrent of tickets,
Oh, I
so
see.
it's
Okay.
the two kind of complement each other,
Sure.
not only from the audience perspective, but just kind of holistically in what we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how do you guys leverage events to kind of promote the next? Is there different strategies you guys use to kind of maintain, attendance and maintain, making sure there's always a back end of something? How do you guys kind of more or less move things along with different events?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely partially a geographic consideration. So what I mean by that is that if we have a festival in Dallas and we have another festival in Dallas a few months later, we'll use that festival to help the next one. So, at the end of a festival, fans might receive an email with things like photos and lost and found information, and perhaps a deal on the next festival, assuming
Yeah,
it's on sale. Um, Obviously, the data becomes very important, but more broadly speaking, festivals it's very cyclical, and I think maybe not always do people outside the industry realize that pretty much after we finish one event, we're kind of starting to plan the next one. And while the
sure.
cadence is slower, it's very much a cyclical process. Um, so, while there's these tools I talked about, like data collection, we're certainly looking from a geographic perspective of, oh, those people came last year. Let's tell them about this year.
Yeah.
So that's definitely the way we segment our email. Very much keeps that in mind. Kind of, I was asking our email person the other day, how many segments do we have? Because I was thinking about something, and she was like, I don't know, 400, 500. A lot of segments.
Yeah.
Um, even in a place like Texas, for instance.
Yeah.
We
So,
do worry about, we don't want to annoy people. We want to give them information about
yep.
shows that they can use, right? So we look at, you know, um, while we follow up with people and the like, we want it to be, potentially by genre or artist or by festival or at least by geography, right? So we
Yeah.
think about that a lot in the email campaigns and kind of what you're talking about, helping the last event promote the next one.
Yep. Absolutely. So with COVID, the industry as a whole has kind of seen a rise in costs. Touring, it's more expensive to tour. It's more expensive to bring bands out to venues. You know, uh, Ticket prices have gotten higher. How have you guys kind of dealt with that? You guys have such a big presence on the electronic scene. I'm sure. We talked about this a little bit with working remote, but on the cost side of running things, how has that worked for you guys?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Disco kind of has a few different buckets, but two major ones are club shows and
Hmm.
festivals, and they certainly work together. We probably pre-pandemic were doing kind of like thousands of club shows a year. I think we're being a little more choosy about those now, and I
Yeah.
think a lot of people are. It's not just us. It's even people like Live Nation. Um, I would guess. So there's been a little bit more selectivity, I guess, with club
Okay.
shows, but also more experimentation with festivals. Um, and some of it deals with locations. I think one of the things that came out of the pandemic is people, I don't know, became more interested in the locale of events and like what the experience was like to some degree.
Yeah.
Um, I think people were more interested in, I don't know, being in a really interesting beach location or something like that rather than like packed nightclub again, again, again. So, I think
Yeah.
travel events kind of became more important after the pandemic,
Sure.
with interesting areas. I think, at least for our company, we're trying to kind of experiment a little bit more with styles, whether it be rock or doing an event around the eclipse that's more a little bit more science focused, for instance.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the changes I've seen post pandemic that ultimately are about efficiencies that ultimately transfer to hopefully competitive ticket prices.
Okay.
um, there are certainly things you can do in budgets to trim, but usually budgets kind of breathe,
Yeah.
like a festival. So, if you're doing something people like, and people, I think, will reach into their pocket for, sort of unique events, great talent, great locations, great
Hmm.
experiences. I think um, the financials are sort of an output of that, the success. Um, but I do think people are choosier post pandemic with how they spend their dollars. I mean, we're sort of in a, undeniably some sort of inflationary period.
Sure.
So I do think people are being a little choosier, and therefore, I think promoters are being more selective with their offerings, and sort
Yeah.
of customizing them to be potentially more interesting from an
Yeah.
experience standpoint.
Okay. So to kind of segue over to partnerships, because I know that's something that you deal with quite a bit, and I guess this is a kind of good way to segue with COVID. Have you noticed there is a trend in partnerships being more picky with working with events and festivals, or do you think it's kind of more or less the same?
Yeah, so partnerships, changed uh, for sure
Yeah.
pre and post pandemic. One of the things I noticed a lot is, we actually threw the first festival in the world after the pandemic, as far as I know,
Yeah.
in Dallas, Texas. We were like in, a month after Governor Abbott opened up the state
Yeah.
100%. We produced an event. And one of the things I noticed first is that, and that's a whole story in itself, but
Sure.
one of the things I noticed first is that brands weren't activating, meaning they were interested in the fact that you're doing a festival, but they had internal mandates. Oh, you can't be out on the road, and these sorts of
Hmm.
things. So initially, it was very sticky, but when it came back, I think it's the best it's ever been, and I credit a lot of that to brands like, I don't know, let's say Coca Cola, for instance. If you're
Sure.
worried about, I don't know, your portfolio of products and Gen Z adoption, for instance, you're not necessarily going to run a bunch of newspaper ads, right? Those
Yeah.
days are gone. So to get in front of young people, they're looking for these verticals like activation and experiential advertising, so that young people can get the can in the hand, kick the tires, put on the health and beauty product, whatever, and it's sort of priceless to them. So and a lot of interesting brands have kind of popped up, in my opinion, like the whole ready to drink vertical. So
Mm.
these are brands like Beatbox, Monaco. I mean, even big brands like Jack and Coke have one together.
Yep.
Uh, so I saw stuff like that become kind of more important. And brands were seemingly doing things that were a little more scrappy, meaning like this was not sort of a push strategy per se, as it was like more of a pull strategy as it pertained to retail. What I mean by that is they were activating these ready to drink brands at festivals first, and then you saw them at gas stations later, not the other way around. So I don't know, there's some interesting things I saw there. But overall, it's felt pretty good from a brand perspective, in my opinion. I'll never understand why certain brands don't necessarily seem interested in music festivals. Like we
Sure.
tend to see a ton of liquids. We tend to see, whether it's energy drinks or alcohol.
Yeah.
But there's things like insurance or cars or consumer
Yeah.
packaged goods, which we see less of. And I don't know if it's the dance space or
Yeah.
what, but it doesn't seem to be part of their sort of current strategy. Who
Yeah.
knows? It may change.
Yeah, that's true. When one of the years that I worked with Warp Tour, they had Kia as a sponsor, and they had actually brought in a car on a rotating platform for each of the location of the dates that Warped Tour had, which would have been 30 or 40. So I couldn't imagine the cost behind that, and I can't picture there being a good ROI behind it. So I understand, but I don't also feel like you need to put a car at the festival to be able to get an ROI. You know what I mean? It could just be a matter of placement. Just kind of getting that subconscious of like, hey, I've recognized that brand, I recognize that car, I've seen it before when they're doing their car shopping. You know what I mean? And it's the same thing for other brands.
There's that. There's also like, data's been a thing for a while,
Sure.
obviously, but just like, the ability to potentially offer an audience, I don't know, it's like, you know, pretend you're Volkswagen, you're coming out with this new bus, right? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
you're going to want to do some dead shows and things like that. But to sort of get in front of young people, you're probably going to need some sort of data. And I think festivals can be a great way to get that sort of young data or qualified leads. To extend offers and the like. So it might not even be necessarily something at the event. It could be, okay, yeah, I saw that thing at the gates, but oh wow, here's an offer now for something related to the car, which I
Yeah,
think could be very, very compelling, for a brand. It's like, yeah, you
sure.
saw it there at the Dead show, but now you're getting an offer for it. You know,
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So, on the note of corporate sponsors, what are some of the key differences with working, with a corporate sponsor on a brand partnership level versus working with, say, a local sponsor?
yeah, I mean, corporate sponsors tend to have a set of really clearly identified objectives going into a brand partnership. They often have an agency representing them, whether it's
Okay,
sort of activation based or not. So it's not uncommon that you're not necessarily talking that much to the brand. It might be more the agency.
sure.
Um, Whereas local partners typically are more interested in sales. So they're
Okay,
not necessarily looking at for like awareness or consideration or trial. They're kind of looking for that conversion.
sure.
They're
Those
selling their
impressions.
t-shirts or whatever it might be at the show. So I tend to
Yeah,
see it kind of break a little bit more like that. Brands often want more detailed reporting after the fact too, because they're kind of selling it up the chain. Here's what we fought for in the budget. Here's what we did. Here's how it
okay,
performed. So that's a pretty common expectation you see with bigger brands that you don't see as much with the other brands.
right.
Um, I would say big brands, especially in the liquid space, tend to work with affiliates. So, for instance, if you're doing a deal with Heineken or Budweiser or something, chances are you're going to be working very closely with the distributor in that market.
Okay,
So that can be a sort of a key difference that you don't see as much with like local sponsors. And they might be leveraging infrastructure, things like trucks to keep the product cold, ID bands as a branding moment, but also the functionality of, having the 21 plus band.
yeah,
Um, they might do media spends in the market, maybe billboards and the like, or there might actually be a retail program associated with it, like at gas stations, for instance, where you see point of sale sort of stuff that's branded with the festival, and
yeah.
maybe it's a chance to win backstage or something like that. So
Mm,
those are some of the bigger differences. Often big brands want bigger spaces. They want a big presence.
sure.
40 by 40, 100 by 100, whereas local sponsors might want 10 by 20. So you tend to see that differentiation, and therefore um, you tend to see different pricing. The bigger brands are spending more because they're eating up more, literally more real estate on the ground. So
Yeah.
that's a few things I guess I tend to see.
Okay. So, how do you guys go about building something like a sponsor deck? Do you make it more of a, I know what brands we're looking for, know what sponsors we want, so let's build the deck around that? Or is it more so, let's see how much we could provide, as more of an a la carte versus a your tiered sponsor.
Um, I'm not big on the tiers thing, and here's
Yeah.
why. I know a lot of people sell that way and have success selling that way. So if you do and
Yeah.
it works for you, great.
Great. Right.
What I find is, especially these big brands, kind of come with their own agenda, as I just mentioned. So you're tier one, you're going to get this and this and this. They might have some tacit interest in that, but typically they have deal points they want. We want 40 by 40 space. We want to be on the menu. We want to be this price. We want this amount of social posts, and we want some data after the fact or something
Sure.
like that. Sorry, my kid's waking up from a nap. So
It's okay.
um, so yeah, so those are some of the things they often come with. So if you have these pre-described buckets, like probably doesn't even work in the first place.
Sure.
The second thing is decks, I think, are really there to kind of whet interest. And what I mean by that is like you explain what the event is, what they really want to know, things like expected attendance. They want to know if you have historicals, what your typical historical demographic data is. They may have questions on how that aligns. What percentage of the crowd is 21 plus, for instance.
Okay.
They do often appreciate interesting sort of branding opportunities, but we tend to get into those more during the conversation.
Sure.
A little less like upfront, like here you go, here's the interesting stuff. We want to learn what they're trying to do first and how to leverage what we have, whether it be space or data or whatever, how to leverage that against that to solve their objectives.
Yeah.
Sometimes you kind of know, for sure. But generally speaking, we don't necessarily do those tiers. It's more about telling them about the event. And sometimes, you ask something about this, we definitely are looking for a certain category. Oh, we don't have, vodka's up this year at, Lights All Night. Let's go find a vodka company.
Yep.
So we might talk to a few distributors, a few companies, but often they're multi-year deals, not usually more than two, but or across festivals. We might have Red Bull across festivals this year, or something along those lines.
Sure. So in terms of talking to different types of sponsors, you mentioned Liquid is a pretty heavy one. Those ones you typically go through a distributor and you get your partnerships that way. But what about other products where if you have a mentality of like you want to get that particular sponsor or sponsor type, that product type, and as you said earlier, that they typically go through a third party and they contract them out to do all of their negotiations. How do you get that communication? If you just kind of a cold email, is it more or less in the industry?
There's some stuff that comes inbound. Often we get really interesting stuff that comes inbound, like, hey, I saw your event, I'm interested.
Sure.
Saw one of those just in the last couple of weeks that'll probably turn into something kind of big.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, we're using an agency to talk to other agencies. We're not calling up Monster or Red Bull. And we have those relationships now, but
sure,
when it comes to like the new thing, it's generally an agency on our agency of record talking to their agency of record. So this would be, there's often companies like MTKG out there that activate, brands like Diageo's portfolio. In theory, I'm not sure it's true, but so there's often things like that going on.
Okay. And is that something that is typically you budget for, or do they get another percentage of what's taken in, or how does that process?
They're usually percentage-based deals. It kind of protects everybody. Some people will have like monthly retainers in their deals, just to handle the filing. That sometimes the responsibilities are divided differently. For instance, you could have an agency that does things soup to nuts agreement through the activation and reporting, or you could have an agency that just sort of gets the deals and a company like ours sort of executes against it, and perhaps that would qualify you for like a lesser commission or to maybe get rid of the monthly retainer. But they're often pretty much, you start to see stuff like 20, 25%. and sometimes there'll be deals where money's kept in escrow, or the money has to be received, or before it's paid out. That's the
Sure.
nuances of it, but
Yeah.
they're usually sort of roughly percentage based deals.
Okay. Cool. So I got one more question, and then we'll pretty much wrap it up here. As far as we're gonna go back to a little bit of the marketing stuff. As the industry evolves, what are some upcoming trends or changes you foresee? And I know we talked about SMS, but is there anything else that you think, you know, would play a factor in event marketing and promotion?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of talked about this a little bit throughout the podcast, but I think, if you're talking about music and you're talking about events that are supposed to attract sort of young people, and whether it's electronic or country or rock, that's often the lifeblood of sort of the live space, these young people who come to these events and those sorts of things. I think you have to fundamentally examine and appreciate who this audience is. And that could have a lot of different ramifications. It could be your brand partnerships, it could be the way you price things, the acts you book, etc. But I think young people often get a bad rap. They're obsessed with their social media or this or that. I think Gen Z is an interesting generation in a variety of ways. Just how they think about philanthropy, and how the companies they support, and how they purchase products through media, how they think about the world and some of the issues related to our world. So I don't discount it at all, and I think there's magic in that. And I think the more promoters kind of get in line with that and don't, it's not so much about TikTok and, oh, I'm behind schedule, but more just sort of genuinely interested in their audience and what sort of makes them tick. I think it's sort of platform agnostic, right? It's more about the way things you talk about and the way you communicate with these people and what they value. And they're not dumb. They want to see the people behind companies. They want to kick the tires, as I mentioned, and they want authenticity more than ever. And I think that's why we've seen these platforms that, while they're not necessarily authentic, they're it's rougher video usually, right? It's not like corporate slick video. I think that appetite's sped up, and it's shorter. It's snackable. We could call it attention deficit disorder, but the reality is, the last 20 years we've been had bombarded with marketing messages, and it's just kind of the way of the world that people want to scroll through stuff and decide what resonates with them. So I guess that's sort of a winding answer, but I think there's a lot of promise with this Gen Z essentially generation, and how we market to them is going to be a little different. What they value is a little different.
Absolutely. All right, Evan. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to maybe get Donnie on next time, and get some of his stories. I would love to hear some of those. Yeah.
They're great stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So.
Way more exciting than mine.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. You too.